2020 production of the Gnome Show. You might notice it's a little bit different this year. And we are all wearing these lovely masks. Really is a mask. Now, even from home, if you listen very carefully, you may hear them. Do you hear them? Here they come!
In rural areas, these home administrators often live in the rafters of barns, where, if they are treated well, keep an eye on the livestock, as well as the crops.
Another variant of their name is to put in quarter or to do a job. With or without an apron. Besides, the gnome was an accepted member of society in Europe, Russia, and Siberia.
Gnomes received regularly, and people in all stations of life were rewarded, punished, helped, or hindered depending on how attitude.
It was a situation they seemed to find quite normal.
But that was the time when the waters were higher. Peacefully from one settlement to the other.
When the heavens were filled only with birds and stars.
Twinkle, twinkle, twinkle.
Since that time, gnomes have been forced to retreat to hidden corners, both above and below ground, keeping well out of sight. So much so, in fact, that belief in their existence is waning rapidly. Nevertheless, just as if you do not look carefully, you will fail to see a hare in the meadow or a deer in the forest, so it is with gnomes.
You may not see them, but they're there all right.
Now that we are so concerned with saving what is left of nature's treasures, there is some hope that gnomes will again move about more freely. More and more, people are beginning to realize that they have neglected but forgiving and wise Mother Nature.
These people will undoubtedly be gnomes. And we dedicate this performance to all of you in hopes you will gain much pleasure from these encounters. I'm Gnome Grace. I'm Gnome Walden.
I'm Gnome Miles.
I'm Gnome Piper. I'm Gnome Bella.
I'm Gnome Tamara.
I'm Gnome Lucy.
I'm Gnome Marissa.
I'm Gnome Oscar.
And I'm Gnome Autumn. And there's nobody else.
And now, legends, Legends! Legends of the Gnome!
And now, for the 44th time, the poor woodsman. In a small house in the middle of a dark and sprawling forest lived a poor woodsman. He had a wife, many children, and a black cat with one eye who kept the rats and mice at bay. The children had to walk 2 hours to get to school. Beside the little house was a vegetable garden and even a little flower garden. In the barn were 2 skinny goats and a pig. But the family could hardly manage on the meager earnings of a woodsman, even though the father left the house before dawn and arrived home exhausted long after sunset. Though they had plenty of firewood and a clear stream nearby, the wife often sighed to her husband,
I don't know how we can possibly bring up all of our children.
and the woodsman would shrug his shoulders and say,
I can't work any harder than I already do.
and this was true. One day, as he was arriving home in the twilight, he saw in the distance the cat leaving the woods with a rat in its mouth. But something was strange. This rat had no tail. Filled with curiosity, the woodsman approached the cat, who was sitting under a bush. She hissed malevolently as he came closer, but the woodsman wasn't afraid. He grabbed the cat by the base of her tail with one hand and with the other pressed against her jaws until she opened her mouth and let the thing fall.
Well, I'll be.
Said the woodsman, because what he had picked up was not a rat, but a gnome woman. She was dead. The woodsman had seen a gnome once, but not a female one. He took her inside and wiped away a few drops of blood on her cheeks and lips. His wife and children stroked the doll-like little being and laid her on the window seat in the living room. While they ate their meal of potatoes and bacon fat in the kitchen. When they came back, the little gnome woman was gone.
Gone? Perhaps that cat has got her again.
The wife said, but the cat still sat sulking under a bush outside, showing one angry eye. The family gave up searching and went to bed, as everyone had to be up early in the morning. The woodsman woke up in the middle of the night. Something was tugging gently onto his ear. Beside his head stood a gnome.
You saved my life. What can I do to reward you?
I thought you were dead.
I was only pretending to be dead. Oh, a scratch here and there, black and blue mark there, but I'll get it. Anyway, what can I do to reward you?
Do you have a way for me to get a hold of you?
Oh, yes, actually. A surprise, isn't it? I have a tiny flute. Load it when you want for me to return.
And just like that, she disappeared. The woodsman and his wife discussed the matter the rest of the night. They finally decided to ask if they might have 3 wishes, just as in the fairy tales. Following evening, the woodsman blew on the flute. Shortly thereafter, the gnome appeared.
I would like 3 wishes.
Said the woodsman, somewhat timidly, while his wife poked the fire behind him.
Go on, what is your first wish?
I would like a nugget of gold so that I don't have any more money worries.
The gnome shook her head.
Gold seldom frees happiness.
I don't care.
Go on, what are your other 2 wishes?
We haven't decided yet.
Just belong with me and I'll be returned.
said the gnome with a sigh. The next morning, there on the steps of the little house lay a gold nugget as big as an orange sparkling in the sun. The woodsman grabs it up and yells,
We're rich!
We're rich!
We're rich!
and then he carries the nugget to the village to exchange it for money.
But no one in the village had ever seen a gold nugget, and no one knew what it was worth. The blacksmith advised the woodsman to take it to a jeweler in the city.
Take it to the jeweler in the city.
The woodsman set off at once, but instead of going the long way, he took a shortcut through the swamps that he remembered from the days of his youth. As he danced along the way, admiring his gold nugget, he slipped off the path and plunged into a quagmire, and immediately began to sink. He tried to reach out for firm ground, but he couldn't make it. In one hand, he clutched the gold nugget, and with the other, he struggled to get the flute out of his pocket so he could signal the gnome. He was barely able to reach it and blow a shrill blast. He had sunk up to his neck in mud when the gnome appeared.
Get me out of here!
That is your second wish.
Said the gnome. She stuck 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled shrilly. And in a few minutes, she was surrounded by 4 other gnomes.
Huzzah!
Using their little axes, the gnomes chopped down a tree so that it fell across the quagmire, right next to the woodsman. He was able to hoist himself up onto it and get back to the path from which he had fallen. When he looked around, the gnomes had disappeared. But still he had the gold nugget in his hand. He went on his way, muddy and shivering. Eventually, his clothes dried and his courage returned. He found a jeweler in the city and entered her shop. The jeweler was a distinguished-looking person in a white smock. She wore gold-rimmed glasses. Frowning at the enormous nugget of gold and at the woodsman's bedraggled appearance, the jeweler weighed the nugget. Then she asked the woodsman to wait a few minutes and scurried out of her shop, through the back door, to notify the police. A half hour later, the woodsman found himself in the police station.
Tell us where you stole the gold.
Said a police sergeant in a motherly fashion. The commissioner of police asked the same question an hour later, but in a less motherly fashion.
Now you're gonna tell us where you stole that gold.
I didn't steal it. I got it from a gnome.
Not a grain of gold has been found in this deep for thousands of years. But this gentleman right here, he thinks he found a nugget of gold. Lock him up.
The commissioner had never seen a gnome, and never would because she was such an unpleasant person. During the days that followed, the woodsman was questioned again and again and threatened with dire consequences
I'm gonna tire your consequences.
if he did not reveal the source of the gold.
If you do not reveal the source of the gold,
Finally, he was examined by a doctor, but even she could cast no light in the matter, except to report that the woodsman kept babbling about gnomes.
Gnomes? Gnomes?
None of these people had ever seen a gnome because they all had ugly souls. Meanwhile, the gold nugget was kept in the vault of the city council. After a week went by, the woodsman became so miserable that one night he blew his flute. After 2 long hours, the gnome appeared.
My wife and kids need me. You have to get me out of here.
That's your third wish, but I've already taken care of your wife and children.
The gnome went that same night to consult a lawyer in the city who had a house gnome. Next day, the lawyer succeeded in having the woodsman freed owing to a lack of evidence.
A lack of evidence.
But the gold remained behind for safekeeping until its theft could be verified.
The woodsman gladly went back to his work. The forest had never seemed so spacious and free as it did after his stay in that stuffy cell in the city. He was happy and satisfied, even though he often thought of the gold. From that time on, things improved for him in all sorts of ways. First, a rich foreigner bought all the logs the woodsman had cut for twice the usual price. I want all of your logs for twice the normal price. Oh, you know what? You're such a shrewd businessman. I want you to be my overseer. I will even help you move. I will get you a big house at the edge of the city next to a good school. The happy woodsman was given a big house at the edge of the village and close to the school. He earned much more than before, and his troubles were over. A few months later, he came across the gnome in the woods.
And have you got your gold back yet?
Not yet. It seems a crime in this country to possess gold. But look, even without it, my troubles are over.
So there you are, the gnome said, and disappeared into the bushes.
Siberia is covered by a sparse forest, half the size of Europe, called the taiga. There are also mountain chains discovered only in 1926, in which perfectly preserved frozen mammoths have been found. In the winter, there are 3 hours of daylight, and temperatures hover at 55 degrees below zero. Amidst these bleak conditions, the northern lights offer a show of dumbfounding beauty. Fur-bearing animals inhabit the area.
The fox.
Small gray squirrel.
The lynx, mink,
Martin.
The wolf.
Also reindeer.
And shaggy-haired wild ponies.
Large-limbed, hardy gnomes with piercing eyes also live in the taiga. Unlike woodland gnomes, they are not invariably friendly and can be vicious if crossed. These gnomes often tease the trappers, who, owing to the nature of their work, spend long weeks trekking through the icy taiga. The gnomes spoil animals' tracks, cause avalanches, remove trailblazing marks, imitate wild animal calls in the night, and warn animals of hunters' approach. North of Omayakan, there lived a gnome named Kostya, who was much more mischievous than the rest. He was a giant of a fellow, more than half again as large as woodland gnomes, even measured in his socks, and he made everyone in his part of the forest tremble with fright. If he discovered hunters in his territory, he went to them and demanded they pay a toll.
I demand you pay a toll.
The best pelts they had.
The best pelts that you have.
If they hesitated, he threatened to make their reindeer ill.
I'll make your reindeer ill.
Or cause them to fall off a cliff. Knowing full well that the hunter depends on the reindeer for his livelihood.
But I depend on the reindeer for my livelihood.
I know.
Eventually, all this came to the attention of the gnome queen of Siberia. A stream of complaints had reached the court. Gnomes were getting a bad name, and the queen decided that it was time to teach that scoundrel a lesson. So she summoned a pair of wise old gnomes. They conferred for a day and a night and hatched a plan. Then the younger and more clever of the two was sent off to do the job. First, the clever gnome went to the wild ponies and spoke to the leading stallion. An hour later, a dozen swift ponies swarmed toward the south and formed a giant half circle. They would act as a lookout. As soon as one of them saw a hunter entering the territory of the malicious gnome, he was to alert the stallion. Meanwhile, the gnome galloped off to the roosting place of a friendly owl. He returned to the half circle of ponies, the owl flying alongside. After a 2-day wait, the ponies signaled that a hunter riding a reindeer was heading in a northerly direction. The ponies were thanked and sent home. And the stallion and the owl and the gnome followed the hunter's tracks in the snow. They waited until he had set his tent up for the night. Then the gnome appeared and spoke to him. The man said he would be happy to cooperate with them in punishing the wicked gnome, as he had heard many unpleasant stories about him. Leaving the hunter with his instructions, the stallion returned the gnome to the court. Next evening, as the hunter once more set his tent up for the night, Kostya appeared and demanded a pelt.
I demand a pelt.
Here is some of my best offerings.
The gnome growled suspiciously, but took the fur and disappeared with it into the forest. 2 days later, at twilight, he accidentally passed the same place and was very much surprised to see a most beautiful fox pelt hanging on a branch just over the spot where the tent had stood. The gnome remained at a distance and continued to stare silently at the pelt for a full half-hour. He then circled around it 3 times, peering at it suspiciously. Finally, he decided that it was all right. The hunter must have forgotten it, a windfall. In his greed, Kostya did not see the owl pressed tightly against the trunk of a spruce tree a short distance away, and he began to climb the tree to retrieve the fox pelt. It had a smooth trunk with a few branches, and the gnome had to use his hands and feet in order to get a firm grip. When the gnome was halfway up, the owl suddenly swooped down and snatched the cap from his head. The gnome ranted and raved so much that he lost his grip and fell to the ground with a thud. Too late, the owl with the cap in her claws was flying high above the trees toward the palace. The icy night was far from agreeable to the bare-headed gnome. The only thing he could do was pull the collar over his jacket over his freezing head and hurry home. He was so angry that he stayed indoors for a week, giving his poor wife a terrible time. "You're giving me a terrible time."
Go make me my rutabagas.
Now, he could have made a new cap by making felt from some of his furs in the house. But a cap is an irreplaceable possession for a gnome. He wanted his own back, no matter what the consequences. Although he was wicked, the gnome was far from stupid. He knew that there was more to the matter than met the eye. Even so, it was 10 days before he could summon up the courage to cover up his head with 2 of his wife's kerchiefs and present himself to the queen. He had lost weight and felt humiliated.
Humiliated.
At court, he was coolly received and had to wait 3 hours before the queen and her council granted him an audience. The queen sat on a dais. She was smaller than the gnome, but she radiated an air of
Absolute authority.
I hope this is talking a lesson, Kostya. None of us are angels. You're Do you understand?
Yes.
Mumbled the guilty gnome. The queen placed a foot under the cap and flipped it into his arm, saying,
You put it on outside.
the giant gnome felt very small. He turned around, went out the door, left the palace, and did what he had promised. For gnomes,
Be they good or bad, always keep their word.
It was the end of January. A severe northeasterly wind was blowing and the thermometer registered 30 degrees below zero. Everything in the fields and woods was frozen stiff, and the gnomes' outdoor activities were reduced to a minimum. Useless, of course. Someone was in need of help. In the cozy, safe houses under the trees, games were played and stories were told. Imraj thought up something new every night. His great-grandfather had known Warche, the magic goldsmith who dared to do everything, and had told stories about him to his son, who had told them to his son, who had told them to him. One night, Im's twin daughters, tired and sleepy-eyed from playing, sat at their father's feet and begged for a new story about Warche.
Let's see. Have I told how Warche got back the gold and the precious stones a dragon had stolen and returned them to the elves of Saja?
Yes.
And how, to save the life of a little human girl who lay dying, he plucked a life-giving herb in a land in Siberia that was guarded by a ferocious dinosaur.
Yes.
And how during a storm, he slipped off the back of an osprey and fell into the middle of the bewitched lake of Warnus and was brought to shore by a blind carp.
Yes.
And how he was captured by the trolls?
No.
Okay then. Warche was always falling out with the trolls. He was far too clever, and they couldn't stand him. You remember that Warche had 3 houses, one in Poland, one in the Ardennes, and one in Norway. He always had trouble with the jealous trolls. Now, Warche rode a large fox, from one who ran more swiftly than the wind. He could travel from one house to another with his wife and his goldsmithing tools on board in less than one night. Once, when Warche was in Norway, the trolls dug a hole alongside a path that he normally used. They crushed a number of mice with their filthy fingers, smeared them on the sides of the hole. Warche and his fox passed that way a few nights later. They had been on a long, tiring journey and were both extremely hungry. As they neared the trap, the fox smelled a strong odor of mouse and dashed into the hole. Before Warche and his fox realized, they were trapped. Warche must have been very tired indeed to have been tricked in such a fashion, but they could do nothing. The trolls dragged them through an underground passage and into a cave, and they shoved Warche behind bars in a side alcove. Fox was put in chains.
No, you forged gold for us. We'll never set you free.
Every day, they pushed a nugget of gold through the bars and ordered,
Make us a ring, a bracelet, a necklace, and you won't get a mouthful of food until you're finished.
and they threw an old bone to the fox. That is, if he was lucky enough not to get a well-placed kick instead. Warche had to follow their orders because he had found no way to escape, and he had to think of the plight of the poor fox as well. The trolls wore the bracelet rings and necklaces on their misshapen arms, necks, and sausage-like fingers. They danced and danced in their filthy caves until the sweat ran off their bodies and the place stunk worse than usual. When after 2 weeks, Warche had not returned, his wife Lisa began to worry. Warche had often stayed away in the past, but never as long as that. One night, she went out to search for him, which was very brave of her. She asked all the animals if they had heard anything of her husband.
Have you seen my husband at all? I can't. I haven't seen him in about 2 weeks. Have you seen Morche at all? Have you? Have you seen Morche?
But none of them had. At the foot of the mountain, Lisa did run into a rat who had fled the cave where Warche was held captive. Because the stench was too much, even for her.
She'll never get it out. The only cat she was with, I can tell you, they keep the key in the third of clove, the crack in the wall. On the main door, there's only one bolt, but it's too high for you to reach.
So that evening, Lisa made a plan. She gathered together some pans, rotten eggs, and asafoetida.
Huh?
Asafoetida, a gum-like resin that trolls adore, but can never get because the plant which produces it grows in faraway Persia. They love it because of its terrible smell. Lisa disguised herself as a sorceress with a tall, pointed cap covering her own cap and a black robe. She set up a wood fire on a flat rock not far from the troll cave and begun to cook her brew. Before long, the revolting smell was wafted into the cave, and the trolls, following their noses, waddled furiously outside.
What's going on here?
They asked suspiciously, a bit afraid of the little sorceress.
Nothing exceptional, sirs. I am just a poor sorcerer trying a simple evening meal.
Smells good.
Would you like to taste them? But only a mouthful each, as this is all I have.
Trolls tasted a mouthful and declared that they had never tasted anything so delicious.
So delicious.
I see you like this simple meal. It just so happens I will be here tomorrow. Do return with your entire family. How many people should I count on?
27.
87 me.
The trolls said, more dim-witted than usual, because they could think of nothing but the heavenly taste on their tongues.
Okay. Come back tomorrow just before sunset. You can let your own fires go out, as I will prepare enough food to last you 3 days. But I will not be here tomorrow, as I have business to attend to in the neighborhood.
The next evening, the trolls found 5 portions of eggs, beans, and the devil's dung, and a huge pan with enough in it for the next 3 days. While the trolls were stuffing themselves, the little woman climbed atop the chimney and lowered herself into the cave. The lazy trolls had actually let their fire go out. Lisa ran to the third crack in the wall, grabbed the key, and set Warche free. He quickly unchained the fox, and standing on the fox's back, lifted the bolt of the outside door. They left in a hurry, but the fox was stiff after being cooped up for so long and weak from hunger, so they couldn't maintain a fast pace. Fortunately, the trolls were so greedy that after eating all 5 portions, they gobbled up all the extra food as well. When the trolls reached home, belching loudly, they saw what had happened and cursed Warche loudly.
Curse Warche! Loudly!
But their bellies were so stuffed, they couldn't move an inch. They slumped to the floor and fell asleep. Now, to bed with you all.
The gnome girls were soon fast asleep in their cozy and close bed. Mother later discovered that they had smuggled a field mouse in with them when she put them back in Peter's basket. The heavy odors surrounding the house shook softly as the icy wind blew above their branches. But below, in the sturdy gnome dwelling, it was warm and safe. At least for trolls.
Sleep spice, Mama. Sleep spice, Papa.
Sleep spice is how gnomes say good night.
The coldest place in all the world is far north of everywhere, and is simply called the North Pole. It is so cold that not much lives there except for one small creature, a lonely gnome. Now let me tell you, that gnome was cold. In fact, she was so cold there in the North Pole that her ears were a frosty pink and her nose was a bright, bright blue. She would scream, "Ah!" shout, "Ah!" stomp, just trying to get warm. For you see, the gnome was cold from the inside out.
If I shout,
She shouted.
the cold will get out and not stay in.
Sure enough, every time the gnome shouted
Ah!
or screamed,
Ah!
a puff of white steam would come out. But she was still cold from the inside out. One day she decided she couldn't stand it any longer and decided to head south. South? Where it had to be warmer. She gathered all of her things, her icicle toothbrush, her favorite purple pajamas with white fuzzy feet, and her magic paint set, given to her by the master of northern lights. She packed them all in her knapsack and decided to head south.
She walked, she shouted,
Ah!
she skittered, and she skated until she came to what is today called Alaska. Much to her dismay, she was just as cold there as she had been at the North Pole.
Darn!
She shouted,
I'm too tired to go on and I'm still freezing.
Then the gnome spotted all the branches and sticks lying around.
Maybe
She thought loudly.
if I light a fire, I can get warm.
She set about collecting wood and building the biggest bonfire y'all have ever seen. The gnome stood far away from the fire and waited to get warm. But nothing happened. She stood a little closer and still nothing happened.
Finally, she did what you are never supposed to do and stood so close to the fire that her hair began to smolder.
Oh no!
She shouted and jumped headfirst into a snowbank to put out her smoldering hair.
The poor gnome felt so dejected, he just sat on a frosty log and began to cry large, frozen tears.
Oh dear, there must be no way in the world for me to get warm from the inside out.
As she sat there crying, a sea otter happened by, shaking and shivering, and wearing a honey-clad scarf.
Why are you crying?
Shivered the otter.
Because I am cold.
Said the gnome.
Then why are you shouting? Because
Yelled the gnome.
when I shout, it gets part of the cold from the inside out.
The otter thought for a moment, and tilted his head back and shouted.
Ah!
Sure enough, out came a puff of cold.
Then, in a cold silence, the two of them just sat there on a log, shivering, shaking, and shouting,
Ah!
trying to figure out how to get warm from the inside out.
You know,
Yelled the otter.
in my travels, I see that humans are never cold from the inside out. Maybe, just maybe, if we ask the humans for their secret be warm from the inside out, maybe you and me could get warm.
Good idea. But we've got to get them to come to us.
Shouted the gnome.
I'm so cold, I don't think I can walk another step.
They sat and thought, and thought, and thought. And finally, the gnome came up with a plan. Came up with a plan.
All humans like gold. I can use the magic paint set given to me by the master of the Northern Lights. Then we can paint everything into gold. Then the humans can come here in exchange for the secret for being warm from the inside out.
The gnome rummaged around in her knapsack until she found the magic can of gold paint. Then she and the otter began to paint everything gold.
When they were all done, they stood back and looked at what they had painted.
With all this gold lying around, those humans are sure to tell us their secret.
Chattered the gnome. And she and the otter set out to tell the humans. The two of them climbed the highest mountain around. And while the otter looked on, the gnome shouted at the top of her voice.
Gold!
Diagram charts.
Come on, let's go.
Gold!
Yes! Louder.
We've discovered gold!
Now, I don't know if you've ever heard a gnome shout, but if you have, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. When I say her voice carried for miles and miles, there wasn't a single person within 1,000 miles that didn't know there was gold in Alaska! The otter and the gnome went to the bottom of the mountain and waited for the secret that would make them warm from the inside out.
Humans were already beginning to arrive by the hundreds, but they just ignored the gnome and the otter.
Won't somebody please tell us the secret of how to get warm from the inside out?
But no one would listen. In fact, they pushed that poor gnome and the otter right into a snowbank.
Just about then, a prospector passed by, and he saw the two sitting in the snow.
Who are you?
Asked the prospector.
Why don't you pick up any of this gold?
Well, I'm the gnome, and this is the otter. We don't need gold. We've made it so you would come here and tell us the secret of how to get warm from the inside out. But everyone has just ignored us.
The prospector thought for a moment and then said,
Wait here. I'll be right back.
he hustled and bustled about until he gathered all the humans together.
Fellow prospectors, we're getting rich picking up all this here gold. The only reason this gold is here is because of the two lonely creatures sitting on yonder snowbank. Now we simply must come up with a way to solve their problem.
All the humans murmured and mumbled, fretted, and fumed until they finally figured out what to do. With cheers
And shout!
they all marched back to the gnome and the otter.
We have unanimously decided to tell you the secret of keeping warm from the inside out.
The gnome and the otter could not believe their good fortune and listened very carefully.
The reason that humans are warm from the inside out is because of love and friendship. That is the secret.
Well, how do we get love and friendship?
Asked the otter through chattering teeth. Prospector thought for a moment and then continued.
Friendship is the state of being friends with someone. Since you're in Alaska, you and the gnome are already in that state.
wrapped up warmly in love and friendship,
Sipping tea
and talking very
softly.
So when you're cold from the inside out and you don't know what to do, remember love and friendship, and warmth will come to you. All gnomes together.
A gnome in time.
Gnome in tune.
A gnome betwinkles the midnight moon.
The gnomes preserve sweet nature's lore
And gifts us with the wisdom of yours.
Would that humankind could learn from the gnome.
To protect all creatures, without and within.
to nurture all nature.
in root and branch.
To reveal a beauty abounding.
Would that I would be known.
In time and in